Hello and welcome to Speak Life. This is the SpeakEasy. My name is Glenn Scrivener, and with me is Nate Morgan-Locke.
Hello, Glenn. And today, what are we going to talk about?
Well, technology allowing, we are going to talk about Facebook outages and WhatsApp and Instagram. So, and we're also going to talk about the fuel crisis.
The fuel crisis.
That has engulfed the nation.
Basically kind of running out of stuff or things not going to plan.
Right, yes. And do these represent cracks in the thin veneer that ordinarily adorns society, but underneath there is just a seething mass of warfare and rage? Is that what's going on?
Well, it's a very good question because, of course, the fuel crisis, in which I think we're still living in the late fuel crisis, but we are
I think historians have the three ages.
Yeah,
of the fuel
ages,
crisis.
the late fuel crisis.
There was Friday, and then there was Saturday, and we're pretty much past it now. Yeah.
But this is not the first time in living memory that we've run out of something, particularly in the UK. And so people are asking, what does this say about human nature?
Yes.
That when we run out of fuel, we have panic at the pumps. We have knives being pulled out from, I don't know who carrying a knife in their car already, but knives are being drawn at petrol stations.
We have Americans in the room. They're just chuckling. Like, how quaint. Knives. People are pulling knives. How sweet.
And so, the question is, does this illustrate the fact that there is a thin veneer of sophistication and culture, and in reality, human beings are just bubbling under the surface, and it only takes a moment for the mask to come off, and we all start sort of knifing each other for a bag of petrol.
A bag of petrol.
People had bags of petrol.
See-through polythene bags of petrol that they just put in their boot, and I can see no bad outcomes from that particular scenario.
It's not going to go on.
It brings my mind back to 2020 and the toilet paper shortage. Which was hilarious because, again, it was just basically like everyone was taking about 5% extra toilet paper. Yeah. And our supply chains are such that we cannot handle that level of demand. Yeah. But in the consciousness, in the public consciousness, it was this idea that there probably is this really greedy idiot, moron who's taking all the toilet paper. And I've always imagined it should be a little bit like in It's a Wonderful Life. You know, when there's a run on the bank. And it's not that one person has taken all the money. I don't have your toilet paper. It's in Bill's house and Jenny's house. And,
This is Glenn's James Stewart impression, which is actually very good, I must say.
Thank you. I'll listen back to it and I'll take notes.
The more opportunities we get to have you as Jimmy Stewart, I think the better. But yes, the fact was that everyone was convinced that everyone else was taking way, way more. And I'm only taking what is prudent to have a couple of extra rolls because that's wise. I'm not panicking.
Yes.
They're panic buying.
And everyone wanted to drive, like if they were in the queue for the petrol station, they wanted a sign outside the car to say, I am actually running low. This is not me being greedy. And everyone was, which goes to show how much we want a virtue signal in these situations.
Well, or maybe the virtue signaling is happening at one level, but of course, there have been fights over toilet rolls.
Yes.
Right? And I think, do we have a clip? I think we can go to one.
Let's see. Nature in its raw state.
This is what happens.
Or at least Australia.
When you run out.
Hey, stop! That's enough! Are you joking? Are you joking? That's not my daughter! I didn't she hit me! I didn't touch you! I took the bag! You came and hit me! You touched you! I took the bag! You hit me! It's me! Go away from my daughter!
Stop! Please!
I just want one pack! No, not one pack!
What's the limit?
You're done. So I just want one package. I just want one. No, not one. And that is that what humanity is really like?
Yeah, I actually find it really hard to watch any videos of people fighting or having kind of violent interactions. I get quite anxious just watching it. which is slightly bizarre.
Well, that's probably the best of all reactions to that, really. I mean, if you really enjoy that, you're like, come on, anyway.
But it's this. We had this conversation before about social media and is it this sort of place where people are just being mean and horrible to each other, or is it actually this opportunity? And I think you've convinced me that it is an opportunity to proclaim the gospel.
It's not a pure cesspit,
but there's something about it. And so when Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram went down for whatever it was, 7 or 8 hours last night, I likened it to the moment in The Shawshank Redemption when Andy Dufresne locks himself inside the warden's office and plays the Marriage of Figaro over the speakers to all the prisoners. It was as though it wasn't like, oh no, Facebook's run out, and suddenly we're going to see humanity sort of and reveal itself. It's like, oh, thank goodness.
Yeah, right.
Facebook's run out. We don't have to deal with, obviously Twitter was still going, but we don't. We get a break. There is actually a break. And there's, I think we'll go on to talk about this, but there is something about the nature of our Western society which is so finely tuned that we are outraged at the slightest disruption to normal service.
Yes.
And so how we react when things don't go according to plan, and according to plan is everything is always available.
Yeah.
And I can always use every app I want to use. Yeah. And what does that reveal of human nature when things don't go according to plan?
Yes, because the supply chain is very much like our expectations for everything. We have a supply chain that is just very finely tuned, very finely balanced, on a knife edge. It's they call it just-in-time delivery. Yeah. I was talking to a Major General Tim Cross, who was interviewed by Sky News all about this stuff because they're bringing in lorry drivers from the army to deal with the fuel shortages. And his whole thing was the army works on just-in-case logistics.
Right.
All of our supply chains work on just-in-time. And those two things are like massively different. And I think more societally as well, we've shifted from just-in-case kind of mentality to everything needs to be just-in-time. And and the chain breaks really quickly.
And there is something about profit margins playing into that, and this being the sort of, I know that the efficiency of a system designed to maximize profit and to reduce waste as much as possible. We are trying to make this machine, which is just gonna tick over perfectly, and so it can't deal with. It doesn't like disruption, but also I think we are now part of that, and so we're thrown by the slightest inconvenience, the slightest disruption. Our plans aren't actually adaptable. We'd like to think they are, but no. We're used to things being done in a very short way. And the question, obviously, that we're asking is, when it goes wrong, what does it reveal? Does it reveal the truth about what people are like?
Yes. And here's where I'm reading a book at the moment by Rutger Bregman, who is Dutch, and he's written a book called Humankind. And essentially, he's trying to, I think, he's kind of very publicly wrestling through with his Calvinist upbringing, and he's sort of moved away from that. And he's like, we don't want to go with the whole total depravity thing. Humans are kind. And one interesting thing he's doing is he's shining a spotlight on veneer theory. So veneer theory is that there is this bubbling lava going on underneath society, and there's a thin veneer of civilization on top. And the fuel crisis is just a little crack, and boom, up comes the volcano. And we are you're only 2 skipped meals away from civil war catastrophe. And he in his book points to lots of different things to say, actually, human beings aren't quite like that. And when the bombs started falling in 1941 and 1940 in London during the Blitz, the theory was Britain would collapse under the weight. Everyone would fight one another so much that they couldn't be bothered fighting the Nazis.
Yeah.
That was the theory. Turns out not to be the case. Turns out that actually it brings out the best in people.
Yeah.
So how do you factor that into your view of society and your view of the human person?
Yeah. And this exact question of what is the nature of man's heart, right? That came up when there was this kind of real life Lord of the Flies story from a couple of years ago, and it was a
60s,
series of boys, a group of boys from I think a Catholic boarding school.
Yeah, in Tonga, I think.
I'll let you pronounce that as the Australasian.
Tonga.
But they found
stole a fishing boat
on an island.
They had a plan. Maybe we'll get to New Zealand. It's like typical teenage boys. You know, they thought that was possible.
Yeah.
And they end up on an island that's basically a rock in the middle of the sea, totally uninhabitable, but somehow they pull it together.
And rather than doing what Golding suggests in Lord of the Flies and turning completely feral and murdering each other, these boys actually looked after each other, had they had rotas. I mean, they had a great, list of people responsible for various things. And to the extent where they were, they weren't breaking each other's bones, they were resetting each other's bones as accidents happened.
Right. They managed to pull some kid. So one of them broke their legs after falling off a cliff, and they pulled him up, and they managed to get some kind of splint going. Yeah. And when they X-rayed the kid, after they were rescued, they couldn't even see where the break was. It's so brilliantly they'd done it. And fights, they had a system for negotiating fights that if anyone had an argument, they had to go to opposite ends of the island until sunset. Yeah. And at sunset, they'd have to come back, they'd have to say sorry, they'd have to break bread together. You're like, compare that to Lord of the Flies. Where they're kind of pummeling Piggy and... It's a hellscape.
So then the question is, which one do you choose? Do you choose the ladies having a violent clash over toilet roll, as that's really what humanity's like?
Yeah.
Or do you choose these schoolboys on the island and their kindness towards one another?
Yeah.
So it sounds as though we got two different kind of groups who can cherry pick whichever example they prefer.
Yes. But I mean, it's interesting that we do the video of the fight in the shopping center goes viral. But my neighbor across the road during the first lockdown, what did they want? They wanted some really simple thing. They were making a roast. I think they just wanted some cooking oil. Right. And we lent them some cooking oil. And half an hour later, they rang the bell. We opened the door. They're not there. And there's just this massive packet of toilet roll. There was 24
So
rolls.
Your neighbors had all the toilet roll.
They had the toilet roll. Right. But in order to bless others and that kind of thing, and that doesn't go viral. But the wars go viral. Yeah. But the correspondence saying, and war has continued not to break out on the streets of London, does not go viral. Yeah. And so we are kind of attuned to the bad news. And certainly this is the argument of Rutger Bregman. Okay. He's like, well, we live in times of unprecedented, prosperity and lack of warfare, and all the graphs are going upwards and going up like a hockey stick, as Steven Pinker will tell us. It's just that we're attuned to bad news, and he will give it that sort of evolutionary psychological explanation that if you consider there's a danger and you're right, then you've fled. If you consider that there's a danger and you're wrong, well, you just got a bit anxious for a second. And so that just ratchets up in the evolutionary psychological model. And so we respond to negatives, we respond to threats, and think that things are worse than they are.
Yeah, and we have a media and a social media which seems to be proving the fact that we enjoy sharing and hearing bad news, right? And sharing the conflict, and if you it seems to amplify angry voices. Yeah. Right. Whereas stories of, and of course there were lots of ways in which people have tried to kind of forcibly correct that. So there was what's the guy's name? John Krasinski, was it? The guy from The Office?
From The Office. Mm-hmm.
Who did his whole good news broadcast because he wanted to spread a little love and positivity. But of course, like, that doesn't take off. It's a thing.
Right.
And then we all go back to watching, all the other news, which is doom and gloom. So, yes, I think we are predisposed to sharing that. But I suppose the question is, are we, as you say, 2 missed meals away from gouging each other's eyes out? Is that the true nature of humanity? Or is the true nature of humanity, Brueggemann's thing, human kindness?
Yeah. And I think what he points to with the Blitz example, for instance, is that kind of shock to the system brought out the best in people. And it's similar to sort of Jonathan Haidt's talking about we're anti-fragile. We're not fragile people. We're like bones. Bones kind of need to have impact on them. Yeah. And it strengthens them. And the bonds of sort of civil society are a bit like that. Kind of we need shocks. Maybe we need Facebook to go out every week. That might be a very good thing for all sorts of reasons. Yeah. But it brings out certain things in society. But I think like the veneer theory is that like there's civilization here and then there's this boiling mass of rage underneath. Yeah. Is from Thomas Hobbes. So he was this 17th century Enlightenment political philosopher whose major work was Leviathan, where he said the state of nature is just a state of war, constant war. Yeah. And what you need is the ruler. And he took Leviathan from Job, and it's a very biblical picture of the ruler bearing the sword. And only a strong ruler bearing the sword can actually keep all these unruly spirits, in order. But it very much gives the impression that there's a thin veneer of civilization kept in check by violence, but the state has the monopoly of violence. And actually lots of despots take great comfort from Hobbes, because they're like, well, you need a firm hand or else out comes all the stuff. Now his kind of opposite number in political philosophy would be Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Yeah. Who says that actually the state of nature is the state of the noble savage, and civilization was the worst thing that ever happened to us. Yep. And man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains, said Rousseau, and the chains are the structures of society. And so what you get if you go with Rousseau is that man is essentially kind and good. Yeah. And we just need to release that goodness and tear down the structures. Yeah. And you got Hobbes saying the exact opposite. And now Nate is going to split the difference and tell us what's the answer.
What's between these two, this false dichotomy that you've
having set up
between
the false
Hobbes and Rousseau.
Can you transcend?
I think that part of the challenge is that both of these, neither of these ideas really include God at all, right? They are both very closed systems in terms of, right, you can only, in a Hobbes worldview, I think you can only have violence. It's kind of the only thing. And the question is, like, how do you get over the violence? You have the most violent one.
Yes.
Who's going to stop people being violent? Like,
yes.
What's going to stop Glenn being violent? Me being more violent.
Yeah. And the answer to a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a bigger gun.
I don't want to get into that, but the idea that the violence is the system that we live in, and the Rousseau system, which is that, well, there's no real accounting for why you have this noble savage. You have a society which is ostensibly made up of people, and yet every single person who's ever joined it has been innocent. So something has clearly gone wrong, and so there's,
it's not man, it's the man. Yeah, that's the.
And so, I think both of them are kind of are lacking something, but both have something to offer us if we're Christians, because there is something that rings true about each. Yeah. Right. You do not need to teach a child to be violent, and yet you can find all sorts of violence in children. There are lots of things that you will not need to teach a child in terms of sharing that a child will naturally do. So we need a much more complex view of what a human being is at the root. and where a human being has come from.
Yeah.
And how these human beings fit into the sweep of history and civilization.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting that both Hobbes and Rousseau come up with their viewpoints at a particular point in human history, right? After several hundred years of living in a kind of Christian-soaked idea. So neither of them are really kind of delving back in the abstract or in a neutral way into the facts and just these facts there.
Yeah.
So I do think both, but I would probably say if you were to take a sort of conservative evangelical approach, you're likely to go, it's Hobbes really, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's Hobbes.
Yeah, yeah.
And Rousseau's just plain wrong.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And scratch beneath the very thin veneer, you get the fight in the supermarket. And isn't this a vindication for what Augustine said about the bondage of the will, or Luther, or Calvin? And I think we can go that way, and I think we can underestimate how thick is society. You know, so yes, you've got human beings being human beings, but the interplay of human beings and what society, what culture is layered on top of that is an incredibly thick thing, and something that can't be just dented by a few bombs falling in 1940.
Yeah.
Because the good that might have brought out of British society had been informed by 1900 years of the Jesus Revolution.
Yeah.
And interestingly, in this book, Humankind, by Rutger Bregman, he is constantly looking for kindness, for instance, as a proof of the goodness of humanity. And you're like, well, I don't think Aristotle would have thought that kindness is the virtue that we're aiming for. You go for wisdom, you go for justice, you go for courage. Who goes for kindness?
Yeah.
And Bregman, like he talks about these studies that people have done about soldiers, how few soldiers actually shoot to kill. And so in World War II, probably only 85% of the kills happen from like 15% of the soldiers.
Isn't that always the way, though? The 80-20 rule?
That's right.
Look, guys, we're doing all the work. If only more people would volunteer.
If only more people would shoot to kill like we do. But, classically, soldiers very, very common will shoot high, Or like at the end of the US Civil War, they in all the muskets that they've found, like the vast majority of them have shots in them, and most of them have more than one shots. They found even muskets that had like a dozen like shots, and they can only fire one shot at a time. And the explanation for this is that as the general is riding past on his horse, the thing to do, you've either got to be shooting the enemy or you've got to be loading your gun. So what do people do? So you load your gun. Is he gone?
Over and over.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he's coming back, better load my gun again, rather than shoot. And so Bregman is like, you see how kind we all are? Do you see how good humanity is?
And how terrified of the guy in charge we are that we have to look. No, I'm not going to not shoot. I'm just taking my time.
Yeah, true. Because that soldier would probably get taken out and shot himself. But Bregman's like, okay, so our index of goodness is on kindness, which is such an endemically Christian thing. Because you go to Marcus Aurelius and you say, like, is it good that 85% of your soldiers are not trying to kill the enemy? He's like, no, that's softness, that's effeminacy.
But see, this is where Brugman is the idea that you can call the repetition of loading your gun without shooting it. The best word to describe that is kindness. It's like, it's not kindness.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is, I think, what, to go back to Rousseau's point about, man is born free, but it finds himself everywhere in chains, is that it's assuming that there's only one metric for sin.
Yep.
And so if there's only one way of identifying sin, which is that it has to be violent, it has to be somehow aggressive, it has to be somehow murderous in a kind of physical, like that's the thing that we're holding back. And say, no, human sin is way more complicated, and we have way more mechanisms within our sinful nature to hold all sorts of other sins in check with sin. Do you know what I mean? And it doesn't need to be kindness that's doing any of those things. It it can be cowardice. It can be
Right.
Incompetence, right?
Right.
It can be just being overwhelmed by the fear of life,
Yeah. So I was thinking about that with the Good Samaritan. So in the Good Samaritan, there are multiple bad guys, and there are multiple ways of being a bad guy in the story. You could be one of the robbers, beat up the guy, leave him for dead. That makes you a bad guy.
Yeah.
But you could be a priest or a Levite who look impeccable as they show up to the temple early, on time to do their religious duty. And yet, in the telling of Jesus, like, those are the guys who you really go away with thinking of the bad. Like we've forgotten about the muggers at that stage.
Yeah. Exactly. Everyone forget who's in the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in a world in which there are shocks and there are therefore needs, the only thing it takes for terrible things to happen is for good people to do nothing. And it turns out that those good people aren't so good.
Yeah.
They're the priest and the Levite, and they walk on by. And that has become a byword in the morality of Jesus. That's a byword for evil.
Yeah.
But it could look kind, and it and it could look like, I didn't get more fuel this weekend. Yeah. Oh, well done. Well done. What have you positively done to lift up the broken and those who are experiencing the shocks?
And that issue that it's not going to go viral.
Yeah.
One person sitting smugly, feeling self-righteous and looking down on other people who were squabbling over the fuel pump. That's not going to go on a video.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the point with the media that we have is that it rewards things which look exciting when they're moving and there's loads of sound.
Yes.
And someone sitting self-righteously like a Pharisee, it doesn't look good. We can't tell what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that kind of sin is then underplayed, is thought to be, well, that couldn't be sinful because it's dignified, it's responsible. And yet it could be the most, toxic, attitude toward your fellow man.
Yes.
It's possible.
Yes. So the veneer is very thick, and in the West it's very Christian already, and it's not the state of nature. And we've had some good comments here. Amanda Kay says the veneer of polite society is kept in check by the invisible Christian morality. The majority accept even if they don't realize it. And it's fascinating in this book, Humankind, that all his examples are those who are heirs of the Christian Revolution. Yeah. And it's the Christian Revolution that makes kindness into a virtue in a way that it's just not. Yeah. The martial virtues of Stoicism or Aristotle or Plato find kindness to be like a vice. Yeah. Not a virtue. The very fact that you're trying to look for kindness shows that you're looking for Christianity. And Matthew John Crittenden has said, Tom Holland's Dominion book has had a profound impact on me recently. Great book, says Amanda Kay. Yeah, indeed. So showing how the very lenses through which we view whether a society is good or not. Like, how many Facebook posts say, a society should be judged by the way it treats the least powerful. You're like, okay, but like, that's Jesus. Jesus taught you that. Yeah. What seems obvious and natural and universal is nothing of the sort. So there's that. So the veneer is incredibly thick and incredibly Christian. And what lies underneath is not just the seething rage of the sinner, but it's also the seething rage of the pious and the Pharisee. Yeah. And like Matthew 5 really got me thinking the other day. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies." Now, obviously, Leviticus said, love your neighbor. Yeah. The Bible didn't say hate your enemies. Yeah. But it had become such a saying among a community that was incredibly devoted to the good law, love your neighbor. Yeah. That had, you add the good law to our rotten human flesh, and what you get is love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And it cannot be otherwise. Yeah. And so law says love your neighbor, flesh says hate your enemy. The gospel of Jesus says love your enemy. Yeah. And that's supernatural. Where's that from? And of course, this is what heaven does. Heaven loves its enemy.
Yeah.
Christ loves us, and then brings us into this, so that the state of nature is wicked, but it's not war on war all the time, because there's, in a war you pull together and you love your neighbor and you hate the other guy, and you cooperate in order to compete. And so we've got to get more Christian, not only about the veneer, we've got to get more Christian about what it is that lies underneath it and what the problem really is. I think.
You're talking about the soaking in the Christian message, in the Christian revolution, the Jesus revolution, over the centuries, has this great impact. One thing I was reading recently was, I don't know if you have ever heard of C.S. Lewis.
Right.
Christian writer, middle of the 20th century.
He wrote some of those Narnia movies. I hope he makes another one.
Yeah, they weren't great, the movies. But I think there are some books as well. But anyway, so he was writing about another Christian guy named, Catholic guy named J.R.R. Tolkien, who had some films as well. And this is what Lewis says about Lord of the Rings. He says, almost a central theme of the book, the first book, Fellowship of the Ring, is the contrast between the hobbits, or the Shire, and the appalling destiny to which some of them are called. The terrifying discovery that the humdrum happiness of the Shire, which they had taken for granted as something normal, is in reality a sort of local and temporary accident, that its existence depends on being protected by powers which hobbits dare not imagine, that any hobbit may find himself forced out of the Shire and caught up into that high conflict. More strangely still, the event of that conflict between the strongest things may come to depend on him who is almost the weakest. So I think what he's saying is that the hobbit is the Shire is the anomaly. If you think of all the areas that you can go to in Middle Earth, the Shire's the weird one, where where smoking is a pastime, and where you just sit around and you live this pleasant life. And there's something about Western civilization taking for granted its compassion and its peace and its kindness, and its concern for the vulnerable. Well, we just assume, that's the normal. That's normal.
Right.
It's like, really it isn't.
Yeah. And
so anyone who's coming up with those viewpoints is not to be, shown as, wow, look at this. This is humanity. It's like, no.
Yes.
This is a particular type of human being that has been soaked in a message which is transformative.
Yes, yeah, and it has to be the supernatural love your enemies kind of grace that creates the humanity that we have come to see as normal, natural, universal, and obvious. And it's none of those things, and it's always got to be the supernatural thing. The natural thing is love your enemy, hate your love your neighbor, hate your enemy. The supernatural thing is not to do tit for tat, but to go way above and beyond. And that is the generosity that's been shown to us in Christ. And on that theme of generosity, I think another thing that the veneer theory taps into is the idea of scarcity. The idea that at any moment, this thin line of civilization will break and we're absolutely screwed. What do we say to that?
I say we don't live in that world. We don't actually live in a world of scarcity and limited resources. The reason we think we live in a world of limited resources is because we are desperate to live a particular kind of life which focuses on a particular set of things that we all want at a particular point in time. And so I think what a proper view of the cosmos does, what a proper view of God's creation does, is to say this is a world bursting with abundance.
Right.
It's a world full of stuff.
Right.
That keeps on producing over and over and over and over again. And yet we've convinced ourselves, because we want to live it in a very particular way,
Yes.
at the same time.
Yes.
These things are all going to run out.
Yes. Which is so ironic because never have we had more. You know, never have we had more stuff. I mean, moving house, you know, you come to realize like how much stuff you've accumulated, and yet never have we had a more limited vision for the abundance of nature and that sort of thing. And I think it is because we are so divorced from where that stuff comes from. We're so divorced from where our food comes from. Our food comes in packages, like little plastic packages. That our food comes in tins, right? Like, and no, I mean, harvest.
Yeah.
We are, you know, in the middle of harvest festivals, and we are remembering how magical reality actually is. You know, you scatter these tiny little things into dirt. Yeah. It rains a bit.
Throw it on the ground. Yeah.
And a few months later, lunch. It's like this is what a magical world we live in.
Yeah.
And actually, our sort of technological societies have done such a good job of delivering stuff to us.
Yeah.
But they've actually shrunk our vision for the kind of world that we live in.
Yeah.
How is it that we're able to live in such abundance and have such a scarcity mindset? It's kind of weird. Sometimes I do a thing. I've got an analogy when I preach, and I say, okay, you're on a cruise liner in the Mediterranean. No, let's put it in the Caribbean, okay? And the ship goes down, and you've managed to find your way to a lifeboat. And on the way, you manage to get into your cabin, and you've got a bag. And into the rucksack, you put some supplies. And you've got some bottled water, some tinned meat, Spam, that kind of thing,
great.
Biscuits. Put it into the rucksack.
What do you take on a cruise in the Caribbean? Glenn's taking Spam, just so
you just
you know.
can't get the Spam.
Spam and dry biscuits. I'm sure they come in there, don't they?
And so you get onto the lifeboat, and the ship goes down. You're in the lifeboat, bobbing up and down, a night and a day in the open water. And then you spot in the distance there is an island. You think salvation, and you start paddling towards it. And as it gets closer and closer, you realize actually it's more like a rock in the sea. You know, it's bare. There's nothing there. Yeah. And your neighbor next to you just starts going, "Gee, I'm thirsty." What do you do in that situation? That's scenario A. Scenario B. Yeah. Same thing. Ship goes down. You get your rucksack, maybe some Spam, maybe some tins and biscuits and bottled water. You get into the lifeboat, ship sinks, you bob open, in the open sea, a night and a day. Yeah. You see an island in the distance, and you get towards it. It's this island paradise. Yeah. The trees are hanging heavy with fruit. You see a gushing waterfall in the distance, and your neighbor says, "Gee, I'm thirsty." Yeah. What do you do in scenario B? Yeah. And the interesting thing is, in scenario B, is it that your moral fiber is of a higher quality at that stage? Yeah. Like, it's not, you could be the most selfish, you could be Jeffrey Dahmer, you could be like the most selfish so-and-so in the whole world, and you're still busting open the Spam and saying Spam for everybody in scenario B. And what it's not, it's going to...
I'm on a different life, though, by the way. I'd probably even turn down the Spam at that point.
Nate's used to a better class of emergency food, but at that stage, it's nothing to do with human character at that point.
No, what the thing that's compelling your generosity is the knowledge that there is abundance, but set before you, so you can be much more generous.
Even if in the moment you don't yet have that abundance, and that's important to say, because you don't get through the blitz by saying, there's probably more in the cupboard than I had imagined. Oh no, there's not more in the cupboard. And you might need to ride out that scarcity unto death. And yet, even beyond that, there is an abundance beyond anything else. So, you need that kind of vision.
Yeah.
Great chat going on. Stoics are more concerned, this is from Keith Hayes, Stoics are more concerned with keeping themselves free from corruption. Hence, they are careful about the company they keep. I don't see an incompatibility. No, that's absolutely true. So keep yourself free from corruption will mean a kind of a love your neighbor thing, although love doesn't play a massive part in Stoicism, but friendship does. Absolutely, friendship does, and that kind of camaraderie is quite a martial thing. But loving across boundaries is the difficult thing, the supernatural thing of loving the unlovely. And this is what's interesting. So you mentioned C.S. Lewis. Is it in The Abolition of Man that he has that appendix where he talks about the different religions in the world and how they all have a love your neighbor
the Tao thing. Yeah.
The Tao.
Yeah.
You know, the Tao is written into all of religion. And I think that's true. And there is a kind of a love your neighbor aspect to every worldview and every world philosophy. It's just that take the Tao, and even if the Tao comes in Leviticus chapter 19, and even if it's the Lord God who sells you the Tao, marry the Tao with human flesh, and you end up with love your neighbor, hate your enemy.
Yeah.
And what you still need is the Jesus thing.
Yeah.
The Jesus thing of supernatural love. Matthew John Crittenden, love your enemy is the hardest thing to accept. I can empathize, but love, it's a stretch. And I guess that is the point.
I can't even empathize. So I'm really struggling with that one. But
you're not an empath?
Not really, no. Yeah. Once got 8% on an empathy test. So 8% of it runs out pretty quick. But no, I think that's right. And the question of actual, love, how do you actually putting that into practice is much more, I think it was Boston who said love is more than a feeling. So yeah, and I think we there's in what does love do in a petrol crisis?
Yes.
Love is phoning people up, offering them lifts.
Yeah, right.
And a free bag of petrol.
Little baggies.
Here's a little,
10 grams.
Yeah.
Amanda Kay says, not getting fuel over the weekend. Little deaths to self like that. Love your enemy. And remind me of a quote from a musician, Strahan Coleman. And his quote is, our many deaths each day are just as much our resurrections. Invoking Christ at every turn, quietly overturning the world. Yeah, I like that.
Well, that's a good summary of the book of Acts, isn't it? Quietly overturning the world.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Through supernatural. Yeah. So like the early church grew through the supernatural.
Yeah.
And part of that was miracles.
Yeah.
And part of that was opposing the way of nature. Like going above and beyond the way of nature, the way of tit for tat. The flesh is absolutely survival of the fittest and therefore sacrifice of the weakest. But then Christ comes as the fittest to be sacrificed so that the weakest can survive. And so he pioneers the way of the Spirit.
Yeah.
And that's the most supernatural thing you can, maybe the most supernatural thing you can do is not fill up on the weekend and give your neighbor a lift instead.
Yeah.
Who knows?
I don't quite know how this applies to Facebook being down. If those, they are called servers, aren't they? The servers go down.
Yes.
I don't know what
before they come back up again to bring life to the world.
But that's it. And then everyone was getting all their messages.
Yeah.
Joyfully.
Well, I think the last word should definitely go to Matthew John Crittenden. What's love but a second-hand emotion?
Sorry, second.
You don't know Tina Turner? What's
no, I know
love
the song.
Got to do? What's love
I
but
thought
a
it was
second-hand emotion?
Was it second hand in motion?
No,
like two hands.
We're seeing this live. That's what I love about live. Nate is coming to see.
That's
the
always
lyrics.
how I'd always heard the song. What's love but a second hand in motion, like on a clock?
A second hand.
A second hand.
No, you're
Is
wrong.
that
Mate. No, it's definitely.
So he means.
It's a second-hand emotion. Yeah.
You know, Jimi Hendrix once sang a song where he said, excuse me while I kiss
the sky. But Frank Zappa sang it as Kiss This Guy.
Kiss This Guy.
Yeah.
But I've literally never known that it was second-hand, as in like you go to a charity shop and get.
Well, a mutual friend of ours, Leon,
I need to go and listen to Tina Turner. That's my application.
This is what's great about karaoke. Isn't karaoke brilliant? Because it's the first time you actually understand what the lyrics of these songs are. Yeah. But a mutual friend of ours, Leon Sim, used to always think that every time you go away, you take a piece of meat with you. And he couldn't understand. Must mean spam. He was taking the spam with him.
Well, every time you go, you've got to take some spam. And the weather with you as well.
And the weather. I think that's about it.
That is probably it. Yeah.
For the Speakeasy. How do you guys like the Speakeasy? We are hoping to go live in the evenings in future weeks, hopefully next Monday. Give you more of an evening feel. Matthew, it might be a bit late for you. It's midnight here for you in Queensland. Sorry about that. But you can always do it on the catch-up. I hope you've liked the video and subscribed. Tap the bell, and you can get more of our stuff on YouTube.
And if you would like to support Speak Life, then feel free to go to the website, which is
speaklife.org.uk/give. Lots of different ways that you can give tax efficiently and monthly, one-off gifts. We really do survive on the generosity of others.
Yeah, there's all sorts that you could be helping us to do, which I think we probably want to repaint these walls. So maybe you could buy us a pot of paint.
Send paint.
That'd be great.
Send
if not petrol, paint.
We could burn it.
Or the paint crisis next week.
Nate, it has been a pleasure as always.
It's always a pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, and we'll see you again on the Speakeasy. Bye.
Take care. Bye.